a reasonable way forward in this space. And that's acknowledging that, you know, we haven't covered the full community or the range of topics, but it at least gets us going in a more linked manner. So again, so just before we start, you know, we are going to be recording things again, and I'll come back to what we're doing with the output from this as we work through the program for today. So before we start, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and waters on which we're meeting and working across Australia, and pay our respect to their elders past and present, and recognise the current and emerging generations, and also note that through Earth Observation Australia and other activities like this, we are working with Indigenous groups on understanding their approaches and how to apply and work with them. So, okay, so just in terms of the agenda for today, I'm just going to share my screen. All right, is that working okay? All right.
Looks good, Stuart.
Okay, thanks. All right. So, final workshop in the Earth Observation for Government Network, sort of introduction to, I guess, oceanic applications. The aim of the workshop series is to establish an understanding of what's happening with oceanic Earth observation products in Australia, and it, again, acknowledge it's only a start and sort of scratch the surface of it. Where we're getting to today is that second point, which is to discuss what are some possible activities that could enable our communities to work more effectively together to obtain the key resourcing, and whether that's infrastructure, training of people, linked funding. How do we actually do that to work effectively together as a community so that we can continue to do the science, to do the research and development, and keep it progressing forwards in this area. So we're in session 3, essentially how do we go forward. The other part of this is looking at, there's, to a certain extent, there's a producers component here and then a users of information, and that's something I know, at least in CRC space, when we're with cooperative research centres, particularly the ones I've been involved with recently, those two groups get a bit mixed up with other people talking about Earth observation, and you have funding agencies and others talking about, well, let's just talk to the absolute end user of the information and say, well, you know, basically what data do you want? You know, what sort of type of satellite imagery do you need? As opposed to pulling it apart and going, okay, you know, what information is required for people who are making decisions about oceanic environments, and then how do you deliver that on an ongoing basis from Earth observation? So splitting those two areas up is important, and we'll come back to it. Just to show that diagram again, people who are responsible for collecting, processing, delivering Earth observations sits across a range of areas. I guess even in the oceanic space, we're dealing with NGOs, industries, university and research institutes, research infrastructure, maybe not so much local government, although we are for coastal areas, but state and territory and Commonwealth agencies. And they use a range of different resources. And so what we're trying to do here is look at how do we sort of link across the continuum there. So just briefly, workshop 1 on Monday was really what's going on in the area, and David gave us an outline of the 4 main application areas, which we extended to 5, adding in sea ice and also algal blooms as another component, and then also showed some examples of applications or services that use information derived from Earth observation. So some of this information was also collected out of the survey that we were running. So we ran that first workshop, and we also got some input from the survey, which I'll come to. The second workshop was getting into more of a discussion about, well, how are those products actually used? And that was more of a roundtable discussion. And so what we're looking at today is how do we pull things together and suggest some appropriate next steps that we could initiate potentially through Earth Observation Australia, as well as working with some of our Commonwealth partners, whether it's in Geoscience Australia, Met Bureau, or the Australian Space Agency. What can we push up to them as recommendations? And it's not about establishing big long lists, but trying to land on a few reasonable steps forward in terms of developing this area. Just to highlight a couple of other key points that came up earlier in this week to help with the discussion. I've got some of David's slides in there. The notion of what's operational remote sensing is quite different depending on your organisation, what you're actually operating to do and deliver, and a whole set of other constraints. And this is something that we see in the terrestrial application area as well. For some people, operational systems they have to have access 24/7, 365 days a year, and they've got to be able to use it. And if it goes down, there's got to be a backup. For other people, an operational service is one that as long as they were getting the information they needed once a week, once a month, in a set format, that was operational for them as well. So when we talk about operational, we do need to take into context the application there as well. One of the ways that we presented research to operations for Earth observation for government's been in a linear sense, and I think the slide that we provided is a really good one, showing that, and a lot of us are already involved in this circuit, if you want, which was shown in everyone's responses in the survey, in that it is a cyclical loop, particularly with Earth observation products and services, where you're building often long-term archives and climatologies. As you improve your algorithms, as they get more locally tuned and more accurate, you reprocess everything. And that has its own set of challenges, particularly if you're working with government agencies who've made decisions based on your previous long archive and sets of numbers, and you get a different answer the next time around. So I think we need to start recognising, and this was a key point of this discussion earlier, that this research to operations is this continual improvement, and it's not just linear, and it's something we need to communicate more effectively. And that's, there's a really critical role in here for collaborative research infrastructure, which is partly down where we've got that test bed environment down the bottom. Just to highlight a meeting that David brought up there, which is essentially looking at moving to sort of operational systems or research to operational systems. And I think, that is a virtual meeting in January. So that. David also highlighted industry drivers of what's happening. And that's, there's a push in the sense of producers putting things out, whether it's new sensors, new products and services. Now we're particularly moving into new commercial constellations of higher quality multispectral imagery and potentially high quality, higher spatial resolution imaging radar data sets as well. So there's a push for us to be able to use that. But then we've got agencies that consume the information, and they have evolving needs as well. So how do we match these two things up, and how do we make sure the best science is used? And that's where we are quite fortunate to have the NCRIS capability, whether it's IMOS for marine, so turn in terrestrial, oscope for geophysical activities. And these are capabilities that do allow us to invest in, collectively used equipment and infrastructure and data collection, but also the really important thing is having skilled people that go with that as well. And that's been a really key part of Earth observation, particularly in calibration and validation, is that infrastructure, it's not just we need these sensors, we need this, instrumented platform, is we need these skilled people in place and everything works together. So that's important. I think another really key thing that hasn't been brought together and emphasised enough across Earth observation in Australia is that we all participate in different international science teams, helping to design, develop, not necessarily launch, but when systems become operational, doing vicarious calibration and validation, building new products and services. And we do a lot of that, and that's something we really should leverage on. So I thought it was useful to show David's slides just to put everything that we've done in context already. So today, two key parts which are really around an open, discussion. Sorry, this was on Tuesday. The first part of today is going to flow out of Tuesday's discussion, which is priority research to operations directions. So we'll start by talking about these ones based on what we covered and what was in the survey. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The survey results we will share in the summary form, and I'll show you where at the moment. But just looking through the responses that we have, I went through and just looked at people's responses and how that addressed some key questions. Key things like, okay, who decides what's an authoritative, analysis-ready data source? There was a range of options there, so that's something to come back to a little bit later on. Calibration, I think we were involved in that a little bit, but not a lot. Actual validation of measurements, whether it's radiometry or altimetry, that is being done, and for derived products and services, it's being done for some of these products. But there are some areas, as Helen pointed out, with sea ice that weren't being validated. And this is an area where we've got a lot of opportunity to actually develop our capabilities, obtain funding, and also use it to drive Australian optimised products and services. What variables did people want? Well, pretty much all of them. But there was some specific requests for more detailed algal bloom products, and also looking at plastics and microplastics on the ocean surface. All right. Helen, sorry, you raised your hand.
Yeah. I just wanted to say, because you were saying that like SST over Australian waters. Well, actually it is. That was the point I was trying to make at the last meeting. It is done, which is fantastic, from RV Investigator, and also from Drifting Buoys. The Bureau deploys a few of the Drifting Buoys, but it's basically a global effort. So the validation of satellite SST from using Argo and Drifting Buoys, that's part of a global effort. The validation from ship skin SST is also a global effort, but over our region, it is only done by CSIRO through RV Investigator and IMOS. So it's, we are responsible for our own patch of ocean there, and we do deploy a lot of Argo floats, which are extremely important for satellite validation for SST, and of course the Bureau of Meteorology contributes to the global network of drifting buoys as well. So if we didn't deploy them, there would be a lot less instruments in the water around Australia.
So that was a generalisation there, but SST under partly done. I was hesitating to put in completely done,
No, of course not.
But it helps to clarify that.
I just didn't want it to appear as if we're not doing anything, because we are.
Oh yeah, no. This is so just a quick sidebar.
Yeah.
One of the challenges we've had with terrestrial research infrastructure for calibration and validation is for Earth observation is how do you present an argument to say, look, we definitely need to ramp up our capability, and then you're going, well, we're already really good at doing this, but it only covers this area, and then the response.
Yeah, I know.
People go, oh,
you've got to give
really
details then. Yeah.
Yes. So this is a lot of what will come up in here is a lot about communication in terms of what we do and how it carries through.
Sure.
Partly gets back to this is also one of our big communication challenges is complete reprocessing and changing often of answers. But I take your point, Helen, and I think you'd also see people make that point about some of those other parameters. Okay, there was a group of questions around, well, are there some application areas that people done the research, they've got them working over, relatively large areas, but not necessarily all of Australia's coastal oceans, or the oceanic areas that we're responsible for. The IMOS new technology, that shouldn't be providing projects, proving grounds, was put forward by several people as an example of showing where this was actually being done. And I think it's great that IMOS has that initiative, and it would be really good to see that initiative pushed into other spaces as well. And then the research priorities, there were a number. I just tried to group them in there. And it is fortunate that some of these areas, and I included the link there to, there was Australian communities looking at priorities for wind wave research, which have been put in the survey, have identified what's required. If you look at water quality measurement or ocean colour, I think as David and others are well aware, both sort of the CIOS reports and the International Ocean Colour Coordinating Group have identified requirements in those areas. So we've got a nice set of resources there. Skills gaps. A number of people did highlight that obtaining appropriately skilled and trained people who have both a domain expertise in whether it's coastal waters, offshore waters, Antarctic waters, as well as having high level, what I call geospatial or Earth observation data science is still a challenge. And that's an ongoing challenge in terrestrial areas as well, and something we could come back and support. So when you see the survey responses, I think it shows that, we do have a lot going on already in these communities. We are contributing internationally in terms of, on ground or in water validation, but we could potentially improve things, and there's some areas where we can leverage off what we've done already and move forward. Okay, so today, those two discussion areas there. So there's priority research directions, and then progressing this for oceanic areas. I did want to spend 10 to 15 minutes roughly on each of those, just trying to get a sense of people's thoughts on what they thought would help the collective, let's say, oceanic Earth observation communities in Australia be able to continue to collect and access appropriate information, be able to transform that into usable products and services, and then work with the groups that are using that, whether it's in government, industry, or defence, to make it part of their sort of decision-making processes. And I'm happy for anyone to pick one of those the 4 points there. Are there any communication activities that could be run? Whether we're talking about national workshops or other types of communication. Priority research infrastructure. So things like I guess it's like a test bed, but the new technology proving projects within IMOS, and there might be others. Any high priority, I guess, validation activities, and then that last one about student and skills development, because of a lot of us do end up bringing the majority of our highly technical people with good, physical or biological domain science together with geospatial data acquisition and processing skills. Still, a lot of those people have come from overseas as well, and we're not seeing a huge change in that. Right, but I'll turn it over to the floor for the moment, and happy to take points in the chat window, or if people want to raise their hands for doing this as well. And then we'll essentially go around the room as well. So any thoughts on, out of those 4, what would be, keep in mind we don't have lots of money to do this, but what would be, the sort of highest value potential return, and that would build on things that are doing already? I mean, yes, we do have the Forum for Operational Oceanography. That's every couple of years. We do have IMOS and its associated activities, but that's not necessarily linked through to the Space Agency and civil space priorities. So interested in any thoughts on how to go forward here.
Well, maybe I can start with a few things. If we think in terms of CalVal, for instance, well, we all know that CSIRO is a bit different maybe, but in the university environment, it's quite hard to do anything like this, over some sort of a long term because of the funding aspect. So that's where having an increased program or something like this in this domain would probably definitely help. Maybe what could help as well, if our new space agency might have a discussion with their counterpart, with ESA and NASA and others, and see whether they could reach some way for Australian PIs to get some funding from this other, because when we provide validation data set for ESA or NASA or whatever, it's coming for free for them basically.
Yeah.
And so that might be something of great help actually, if we could get some direct funding from these overseas space agencies as well, through some sort of an agreement with the National Space Agency. That could help to keep these activities going, coordinate, do things like this.
Thanks, David. Mark, I think you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on your comments about food. So as opposed to it being an event every couple of years, so I've just stepped out 20 minutes before this, finished the Food Surface Waves Working Group meeting. So that's a group that meets quarterly. So I think it's quite a nice coordination activity that could span across the Earth observation space in that respect. Is a similar kind of working group. That group's been quite active and successful in terms of having various spin-off activities. So, for example, we've just had a project funded through the ARDC around coordination of in situ wave obs. So yeah, just as a coordination type tool that's worth being aware of, I guess.
So how big's that working group?
Yeah, so I think we just had about a dozen sitting in that meeting. that really spans across the 4 pillars of FOO. I don't know how across FOO you are. So we've got, good private sector involvement. It's dominated by researchers, of course, but then across the universities and publicly funded research agencies. So.
All right. We'll come back to that in a second, Shane.
So coming back to David's point about sort of PI's CalVal efforts and linking in with the space agency, I wonder if it would be worthwhile maybe gathering those CalVal efforts. I imagine the space agency, I know they're putting together some Earth observation roadmap around calibration and validation. They may want to know what are the activities that are going on at the moment around Australia. Certainly, I know that when I write proposals, I mention the importance of CalVal activities for Australia's, access to international data products and our contributions to space agencies. And the space agency, I guess, is our way of making that case to the government. So I wonder if a useful activity would be to gather those various CalVal efforts around EO.
Yeah, that's actually part of the exercise currently going on with the Space Agency. This roadmap advisory group, or whatever it is called, I think is supposed to do this. I'm not sure where we are with it, but we're supposed to do it.
Just to build a bit on that, I think Shane's point's a really good one, and there's a little bit of back history here, so apologies for the little story. When the last NCRIS roadmap came out in 2016-17, so environmental systems is one of the priority areas there. And they identified areas to be built up on, so highlighted IMOS in turn, and then they did highlight the need for more coordinated Earth observation applications. So as part of that, Earth Observation Australia was approached to help build a submission to NCRIS, which would be around Earth observation, calibration, validation, and that. A number of people were involved in that. So Helen Agnes Lane was heavily involved from the Met Bureau on that, and it was, I would say, still quite terrestrially and coastal focused, looking at it. We had 3 months to do it. I'll circulate we did produce an Excel summary, and that actually had, it was 2017, I think. At that time, it was all the ground stations that were being operated, where we essentially had, measurement buoys in place, but then all of our tower sites on the land, and it's actually quite a large spreadsheet. And then we developed a forward plan for it. It went in, and the short version is it didn't get funded, and it sort of petered out. The primary reason we were given almost a year later was that this is already being done in IMOS, TERN, and OzScope. And despite the fact that we had letters from the directors of IMOS, TERN, and OzScope saying this is a big gap and we need to coordinate it. Anyway, but this gets to a question: is it actually worth pursuing a separate, Earth observation, calibration, validation facility, or is it, from an NCRIS point of view, or is it better to strengthen what we have in like IMOS, TERN, OzScope, and others, and also into the Met Bureau, because they had those links already and you build on it? I'm interested to hear people's thoughts on that, because this is since 2018. That study has been sitting there, and as David said, the space agency has now pulled part of it again to try and build it up, and it hopefully will inform the civil space Earth observation roadmap, where calibration and validation are priorities. But I guess in terms of the mechanism, should we be pushing for something which is this is the Earth observation, calibration, validation, NCRIS facility, or do we try to strengthen what's in existing facilities? I don't know the answer, so I'm interested in everyone's thoughts.
Well, you mentioned the IMOS and TERM, the NCRIS programs.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true that a significant part of this validation, the production of validation data sets is done through them. But strictly speaking, there are research infrastructure. So, to some extent, they are producing CalVal data is not really their essence, I would say. So that's why maybe having a specific NCRIS infrastructure for this because, producing CalVal data is definitely, it's not really, doing any research or whatever. It's just, of course, it helps ultimately to do good research because you have validated products and you can trust all those things and do great science with it. But the activity of producing the CalVal data is not really, strictly speaking, a research activity. So you never know. At some point, IMOS and others might start to say, oh, look, maybe that's not really something we should continue doing forever. And so maybe having a specific infrastructure for this might make sense.
Thanks, David. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting because I was on a call last night with the WMO about this very issue, sort of essential satellite data products and what's operational versus what's not, and what are the contributions from various centers. And in Australia, I guess it's the Bureau really who has certain international obligations to provide calibration and validation services for satellites, and that's part of essentially its mission, right? Whereas the space agency is somewhat distinct, as is IMOS, in the sense the space agency, I guess, has a more of an industry or business prerogative. As far as my interactions with the space agency and sort of my reading between the lines a little bit is that they're interested in CalVal insofar as it funds infrastructure built in Australia and by Australian companies. And then IMOS again has a separate sort of interest, which is I guess more around research infrastructure, supporting research, and I mean those can pull in the same direction, but they can also pull in different directions.
I think there's also another angle to it, and that's what sort of calibration and validation are we talking about? Is it calibration and validation of geophysical and biological variables, or actually signals of satellites, etc.?
Yeah.
There's that distinction as well. I think I'm confident to say IMOS does more of the physical and biological variable CalVal, but the sort of maybe the CalVal that satellite folks are kind of more used to, as in radar backscatter or radiometry and this type of stuff. So that I think GA does quite a lot of that as well, I guess, in terms of radar backscatter on terrestrial. So, well, just wanted to point that there are two distinctions as well here. So might be good to clarify what we are targeting.
I think that's a really good point, Salman. And the other challenge, which is another step of abstraction beyond what you've just said, is that calibration and validation get lumped together and seen as the same thing in a lot of agencies. And for funding, it's like, well, and it's exactly what you've just said. If you pull them, apart, there's also what you do before you launch the system and getting everything set up and calibrated. Post-launch, there's still calibration and you're dealing with physical quantities, but then you actually get into the derived products as well. So that separation is the language around that. That's something that we've tried to push with the Space Agency's roadmap, as well as to try and pull them apart. But you do need different capabilities for doing those as well, in terrestrial and marine. So I think that's a really good point to include in there. All right. Any other thoughts on those together or separate? Yeah.
I guess an advantage of an NCRIS style structure would be it would provide a very direct way of articulating the value of this to governments.
Mm-hmm.
I think IMOS does a pretty, or aspires to do a good job of this, articulating the value of marine observations to the blue economy, and that allows the community to speak with one voice, as it were. And so, thinking about terrestrial and marine observations and the value of these kinds of things, I think that could be quite helpful. Although maybe EOA is the agency or the entity that does that for the terrestrial side.
We're trying to help pull together at least what the key points are from different areas. It has predominantly been terrestrial, but this is part of the approach of reaching out more to coastal and oceanic and also atmospheric sciences. But it's, when you do that, it is that challenge of it's quite a large area, and it's like going to an AGU fall meeting and going, here's one bunch of people, let's talk to them as a whole. But just as an analogy, I mean, Astronomy Australia Limited acts in a similar way for the astronomy communities, where it recognises that there are a highly diverse set of disciplines, which is what we have here. Some are working, on interplanetary work. Some are working outside, our particular solar system, and there's all these different components, but they're able to bring it down to, okay, these are the key things that we want to communicate as important. We're trying to get to that point, but we're not quite at it yet. And that is something that Geoscience Australia is quite keen to see happen across the community as well. Because if we have a consistent communicated need, it'll help us get to that point. That still allows us to have a lot of diversity and difference of opinion within the actual areas themselves, but we're just going to move forward. Okay, I might just, any other comments about research infrastructure before we move on, or thoughts about private?
Just that actually the astronomy one is a good example, I think, because there's, the astronomy NCRIS is extremely successul in articulating the value of that research activity to government. So, I think it makes sense then perhaps to have that kind of a dual structure.
Yeah, and the EOA structure is modelled to a certain extent of Astronomy Australia. And the interesting thing is we're now seeing more discussions across those communities. The concept of validation is an interesting one to discuss with those communities as well, but it's an opportunity, looking forwards in that space. Just one of the other points about infrastructure is the role of, private industry in that, and is it, fee for service? I mean, I guess people already do fee for service, for access to coastal cameras and other things. So I might have answered that question just talking through it as is. So, yeah. All right. Okay. So just pulling together that sort of the priority areas, there's the infrastructure, the calibration and validation. In terms of student and skills development in our area, is that something that people are aware of set programs, or even if it's summer or winter workshops that focus students into the areas that you're working in, or even like research placements and things like that? Are those things present with things like oceanic Earth observation?
I wish. There are online workshops that are routinely run, I think generally once a year by UMETSAT. Have you seen those in ocean observations? Every year or so I get emails about them. I've attended one of them. Pallavi, I think, attended more of them, and they were quite good. You just got to register, and they are aimed at students. I just don't think that we've got the mass. I mean, we don't, you know, here we have so few experienced lecturers, I guess, in Earth observations, but certainly online workshops might be helpful. It's not going to replace, though, students being able to come here to do a PhD or master's and really learn the trade.
Yeah.
It's hard to attract students to the field, perhaps.
Yeah, and even making them aware of that it's there as an opportunity as well. Shane, you had your hand up.
Yeah, am I unmuted? Yeah, so the National Marine Science Committee carried out a survey about postgraduate training system in Australia for the blue economy that may be relevant to this particular aspect of this conversation. And they identified, so they surveyed various universities, research institutes, but also employers, find out what are the skills that they require and what are lacking. Identified so top disciplinary knowledge areas sought by marine sector employers: environmental science and management, marine biology, mathematics, statistics, and modeling was identified as one that was quite lacking. And that may sort of come into Earth observations. I know that the Earth observation, gosh, what was that policy document? Vision 2026 or whatever it was called.
Yeah, the 10-year plan.
The 10-year plan. There was a similar kind of identifying that there was a need for training in Earth observations. So I think that's an acknowledged need, both at the sort of university level, but also in among employers.
If you could send us that link afterwards, that would be really appreciated, please.
Stuart, I had a quick comment, but not related to the current topic that we are discussing. Just before that, when we talk about research infrastructure, etc., and calibration and validation, etc. So I also have a feeling that there is less appetite for investment in Australia in algorithm development for Earth observation on data sets. I think David also pointed out in the last or the one before that the algorithm development part is what he exactly mentioned was that we are sort of dependent on external products as well, in a way. And I think that is a risk that we are still in. And I don't see, at least in the marine space, a lot of work being done, or significant amount of work, even compared to the weight that we have in terms of the strength that we have, the numbers that we have, that we are doing. We are doing that, or even if such work is supported. I'll give you an example of Novasar that I don't really think we have much still in terms of that satellites, algorithm development, etc., or any funded projects apart from some maybe one or two in CSIRO. And that's a big facility that's coming up. And similarly in other areas as well, the target is more towards more mature products, so at a higher TRL level, and therefore the calibration and validation, the point that I made before, the calibration and validation that is usually targeted and undertaken is more on a geophysical or biological product level 2, level 3 product level, rather than level 1. So there is that dependency as well, and it'll be nice to develop that capability. And I kind of think that leads to a bit into the required areas of student and skill development. So unless there is active research going on in that direction, we don't really have that sort of a beacon where we can attract students who are interested in Earth observation research as well. But there is good connection, I think, from near to mature products forward towards their use, partly maybe through IMOS. Hope that makes sense. And
that definitely makes sense. And I think part of it is you see when talking with other people in the community is when they use these products and they ask for something to be changed, is they're like, well, can't you just change that and fix it in 2 days? And it's like, well, okay. And then you go through and do you understand how this algorithm was derived, how it's validated, and you're like, oh, and there's still, that's why we've got communication in there, because, and I think people aren't aware that, if you do have the right sort of skill set and knowledge set, you can put all those building blocks together, and it takes time. One of the advantages of what we do is, it's very graphic and people see the results quickly, but they don't see what's behind it. That's not, and in some cases, if you think about like a lot of the oceanic products where there's been use of networks of buoys, satellite imagery, cruise data, all of those things, it's, and the other part that's frustrating in CRCs is getting background costs that have gone in where someone says, we're putting in background IP, and it's like, well, I have an example of several projects where the agency and company worked out it was almost $17 million worth of work to deliver this annual time series where they could detect change and they knew its accuracy, and the CRC wouldn't accept that estimate of background IP and cost. And they're like, and that was the cost it took to collect the imagery, to pay the people, to do the field work, to do all of those things. And so we need a way of communicating that. And I know I diverge a bit. So I think your points were well taken, and that there's a communication. It's partly communication, getting people aware of there's this direction you can go to build these algorithms. You don't have to be just looking at algorithms to find shopping trolleys or ships and other things. There can be other activities as well. Cool. All right. So whoops, just move on to that next. Okay. In terms of going forwards from what we've just been talking about, and again, I keep saying, this is really just scratching the top of how to potentially start to do this. As Mark indicated before, with the Forum for Operational Oceanography, there's a working group. We've got bits of the Space Agency. With this particular, or these groups, what we are looking for is, a small set of recommendations, which at least goes, here's the scope of what's happening. We have been able to start to identify these as 3 or 4 priority areas to push forwards. To give you an example from a terrestrial application with crop classification, there was an agreed approach which one of the groups participating then agreed to work with others and share it openly. And that was the focus of the workshop on crop classification, was to essentially get this initial piece of information out for people. In other areas, it's been to initiate workshops where people basically who had the bits and pieces of the field data and the algorithms could come together and build a better national capacity. So in terms of trying to tie this up, looking at what we've actually just talked about in the last 20 to 35 minutes, I mean, it does sound like there's 3 or 4 key points that we could put forward in terms of, okay, you know, we're doing all of this work already in the sense of delivering products and services. You know, we're still highly dependent on overseas data sources. We do, to a certain extent, use overseas products and services, but we contribute to the validation of those, but we're still, you know, at risk. We do need to look at how we reduce that risk and have a capability to develop, you know, our own sort of products, algorithms that work here, and improve our, you know, validation capabilities and those sorts of things. So I guess it's distilling what we've covered down into 3 or 4 points. Of, these are some suggested ways forward. They'll come out as like line recommendations in the report. We'll table these with the Geoscience Australia and the Space Agency and essentially look at how we push it forward in future. Just looking at some of the key points in here. So, you know, in terms of what we want the workshop to do is to just start to identify ways forward and pushes down that. To a certain extent, there's a list of possible products and services we can highlight are important here. We do have this spreadsheet that lists all of those products and services, and we'll update that to a certain extent. And then we'll provide, yeah, that basically says what I just went through there as well. So just looking at the bottom of that slide, you know, we'll produce a draft report and we'll come back to everybody with that. It won't be very long, it'll probably be 5 or 10 pages long, and just say, here's what we covered, these are the main points, here's how to go forward with that. One of the things we did want to suggest, and that Geoscience Australia is helping us with, is in August next year, assuming everybody is traveling again, we are having an Advancing Earth Observation Forum, and this is about bringing all these different communities together. We'll be in Brisbane. This was meant to be in October this year, but didn't happen. You'll see a lot more push for submissions on this in January, and it would be good to actually have, you know, maybe this is the place where we have the next part of the, you know, Forum for Operational Oceanography Earth Observation Group or something like that. All right, I'll just stop there. 2 people got hands up. Narendra.
Thank you, Stuart and Larissa, for the invite. I guess I just wanted to make a couple of contributions from a slightly different perspective. I come from the field of meteorology and largely land surface hydrology background, so not directly from the oceanic side of things. However, the areas that are certainly of interest as we advance our next generation hydrological sciences, both in the Bureau and nationally. And there's a fair bit of focus that we want to put on coastal hydrology. I guess for people coming with a background who are not very savvy, let's say, with the satellite-based technologies, an obvious question that comes to my mind is what is possible? The areas that are of interest to us are really things around flooding, coastal flooding, things around coastal inundation. And so the work that we've been doing with CSIRO and the Great Barrier Reef Foundation and Commonwealth and Queensland government around the reef is on water quality. Our estimates are that roughly 90% of the sediment and nutrients typically get transported into the marine environment during the course of these extreme weather events. So what are the possible things that could be helping us out from the, I guess, not necessarily just oceanic products, but let's say near shelf environment that could actually be helpful to this sort of body of work? That certainly would be of interest. Most of the satellite-based research that's done, and I've got a couple of my very distinguished colleagues in this call, so they know very well that that expertise is largely used for numerical weather predictions and improving those capability. Where we want to see the direction and additional investments coming in is how can satellite-derived data products actually improve the coastal hydrology, which is where really people live. So they are the sorts of topics on our mind. The other point I want to draw your attention to, which is something we did for the NCRIS funded initiative, was when the marine modeling community set up their sort of near shelf models for Australia, they really need line discharge inputs. And often that data set is missing, and there was actually a first exercise that was done over 2018-19 to produce the first coastal discharge reanalysis data sets for Australia. So I guess there'll be a need to augment that so that the marine modeling community or the scientific community is not struggling with that data set rather, and that data set is actually available on EOGN website. So that data set, there's a need to maintain in the currency, and I'm sure with time to come, the satellite-derived products that are going to be very, very helpful. So there are some of the things that are on our radar, and what we would certainly from the hydrology community of practice welcome the opportunity to understand various perspectives and what are the things, if you like, the art of the possible that may be in the space of your calibration validation data set. Only last week, I was in a fairly extensive workshop with the stakeholders of the reef, and this came about very clearly that high resolution modeling in coastal areas for relocatable models that are being built for the reef catchments. And they are linked directly to the annual reef report cards and things. So you get a sense around this. I've also been approached by the sort of for the fishing industry around how some of these things could be helped on. So they're the sort of domain that the hydrology community is interested in, and certainly going forward, we'll be looking for some advice and help in that space. So that's about it for me, Stuart.
Thanks, Narendra. I mean, that just highlights the importance of that coastal zone as a key challenging area, and there's a number of parameters we'll need to look at. I did take note of those. David, you had your hand up as well.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to put it down.
Okay, sorry. Salman, yeah.
So I was just going to add to Narendra's very excellent comments. As I'm kind of part of a coastal modeling team as well here at CSIRO, so I sit under that. So I have daily or occasionally these days exposure to that important Earth observation you'd call an application area. And I think I'd just like to add here that coastal bathymetry is also another, and high resolution one is also another product that I think, in addition to what Narendra mentioned, is highly valuable to for hydrology, for all these coastal modeling efforts, and also the effect of extreme events in that zone. So I think that's a good probably point to note down as well. I have people in my team who are super interested in these products, and we still don't have for sure answers for this, even with the many satellites that are up there.
Thanks, Simon. That's a really good point. When you look at the survey results, you'll see that EO Maps put some entries in there, which are extremely interesting reading when you get to it. I mean, they do, I mean, bathymetry is the focus of what they do. But I think, you know, nearshore coastal bathymetry is one of these interesting crossover areas where there's a lot of potential for more work. It's got interest across government, defence and industry for a whole range of reasons. Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. All right. I'm just conscious of time and that, you know, we're over time. I know that move sort of didn't quite ramble as much as some of the others have, but it did get some key points out in this area. It was the start of a discussion that I hope will come back to later on with potentially a larger group and ways forward to actually help us improve what we're all doing in these areas. As I noted before, there will be a draft summary report that we'll get people to have a look at. That may not be until January next year, given where we are at the moment. And then we would progress this through Earth Observation Australia, and also you'll see it progress through Geoscience Australia and their Digital Earth Australia program. So having gotten to that point, thank you everybody for your patience over the last 3 sessions. Particularly thanks to Larissa for setting up and running things, and also David for setting up and running and providing the majority of the content for this as well. So we will take on board what everyone said. All of the typed in notes are also saved for us to look at as well. So thanks again everybody for your time. If you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email myself or Larissa or David, and we'll get back to you and hopefully continue the discussion next year. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Larissa. Thanks, David.